If you want to create a seemingly complex graphic inside of After Effects, it's just a matter of pre-composing. Now let's look at the project that we're currently working in by clicking on the current time indicator and scrubbing through the timeline. Now I can see that I have a null object, and that's what's controlling these two spheres moving around. But just so you can see things more clearly, let me go ahead and select layer 1, and you can see clearly there's our null object, and you can see its motion path is a perfect circle. Now if you press R, it has rotation, and that's what's actually causing these two spheres to move around. If you look in the parent column, you can see sphere 2 and sphere 1 are both children of the null 1 layer. So I'm going to rename this null 1 layer by selecting it and pressing return on my keyboard, and we can call this sphere control. And just so I don't forget it's a null, I'll call it null. Now if you ever don't want to see these control handles in your project, you can just turn the visibility of the null off. It's still going to allow me to scrub through the timeline. I just don't necessarily need to see that level of complexity. Alright, now if I want to create multiple spheres moving around in kind of an interesting pattern on the screen, I'm going to go through several layers of pre-composing. So let's do just that. Let's move layer 1 down just above layers 3 and 4. This way they can be all right next to each other when we go to pre-compose. Now before I pre-compose, I want to make sure that I have motion blur enabled for these two layers. So if you don't have the switches currently set up, make sure to toggle your switches and nodes button till you get to this scene right here. Now for these two spheres, I'm going to go ahead and enable my motion blur there and there, layers 3 and 4, just by clicking on the motion blur boxes. Now if you want to see a preview, you can enable motion blur just by clicking the button in the middle of the timeline panel. There you can see I've got a pretty good blur working for that one sphere. Now let's just disable motion blur for the time being, because we don't need to see it as we're building this graphic. So select layer 2, hold down Shift and select layer 4 to select all 3 layers. Now press Shift Command C or Shift Control C on the PC to open Pre-Compose. Let's call this 2 sphere Pre-Comp and we can click OK. Now let's duplicate this layer, since layer 2 is already selected. Press Command or Control D and that will duplicate the layer. Now I want 2 spheres kind of mirrored on the other side. So I'm going to press S to open up the scale parameter, and rather than rotating this, I'll just unlock the X and Y and change the X parameter to be -100. Now when I press Enter on the keyboard, I have an exact mirror image. So if we scrub through, you can see I've created kind of a cool animation there. Now we're not finished, we're going to go ahead and pre-compose a few more times. So let's go ahead and collapse layer 2 by clicking on the triangle and select layers 2 and 3. Just make sure to hold down Shift and select those layers and press Shift Command C again, Shift Control C on the PC for pre-compose. I'll call this 4 sphere pre-comp. I think you can see a pattern going on here. Okay, now let's duplicate this layer, and this time we'll go ahead and rotate. So I'll press R to open rotation, and let's change this rotation to 180 degrees. Now as we scrub through, you can see we have an even more complex animation. But I think you get the point, and how easy it is to actually create a complex animation just using the pre-compose command. Now there's one more layer of flexibility that we've created based on how we've built this composition, and that's because we can change this sphere graphic at any time. If we open the pre-comps folder in the project panel, you can see we have our sphere element pre-comp. Let's go ahead and just double click that pre-comp. In here we have our sphere element, but let's say for some reason we want to make it a square. I could come up to my shape tools and grab my rectangle tool, and I'll just click and drag and create a square over top of the sphere. I can just turn the visibility of the sphere off if we go back to our complex graphics and scrub through. Now you can see I've built that graphic using squares. So when it comes to composing and pre-composing, you have extra flexibility. It's not just the ability to create complex graphics, but you also have the ability to change your graphics, should you decide.